Beneath the shadow-woven canopy of the Schwarzwald, where moonlight struggles to pierce the interlaced branches of thousand-year-old firs, something stirs in the darkness, not the rustle of deer through undergrowth, nor the whispered prayers of pilgrims seeking sanctuary. Something older, something that remembers when Rome's legions first gazed upon these impenetrable walls of green and black, and turned away in superstitious dread. Tonight, as mist rises from the forest floor like the breath of sleeping giants, we venture into Germany's most haunted woodlands. Here, where fairy tales were born from genuine terror, and folklore springs not from imagination but from encounters too strange for daylight to explain. These are not merely stories passed down through generations of firelight gatherings. These are warnings whispered across centuries of what dwells beyond the familiar paths where civilization dares to tread. The Germans have a word, Waldeinsamkeit, the feeling of being alone in the woods. But in the Black Forest, you are never truly alone. Ancient eyes watch from hollow trees. Spectral voices call through the fog. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind threading through the pines, you can hear the echo of children's laughter or perhaps their scream. Before we walk these shadow paths together, we must understand that the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, is no ordinary woodland. Stretching across southwestern Germany like a dark green ocean, these mountains have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of nations, and the evolution of human consciousness itself. When the Celtic tribes first named these woods Nematon, sacred groves where the gods themselves were said to dwell, they established a tradition of reverence and fear that would endure long after Christianity swept across Europe. The Romans, those master builders of roads and conquerors of continents, found their advance halted by these forests. Not by armies or fortifications, but by something far more unsettling. An inexplicable dread that seeped from the very soil. Tacitus wrote of Germanic tribes who performed ritual sacrifices in sacred groves, where human bones hung from branches like macabre ornaments, and where the very air seemed to pulse with otherworldly presence. As Christianity spread, these pagan sanctuaries transformed but never disappeared. Monks built abbeys in clearings where druids once performed their rites. Churches rose where stone circles had marked seasons, since time immemorial. Yet the old powers merely retreated deeper into the woods, where they wait still, patient as the growth rings of ancient oak. The brothers Grimm understood this truth when they collected their tales in the early 19th century. They were not simply gathering children's stories, but preserving the fossil record of humanity's deepest fears and oldest wisdom. Every witch's cottage, every talking wolf, every path that leads astray, these are memories encoded in story, warnings passed down through bloodlines that stretch back to when the distinction between the natural and supernatural world was far less certain. Deep in the heart of the Black Forest, where the Kinzig and Neckar rivers carve their ancient paths through granite and sandstone, lies a region locals call the Hexenwald, the Witch's Wood. Here, in valleys so deep that noon feels like twilight, the very geography seems designed for secret. The village of Schönwald sits at the forest's edge like a sentinel, its church spire piercing the canopy in defiant proclamation of Christian faith. But the villagers know better than to venture into certain groves after sunset, for this is where the old religion never truly died. The legend begins in 1486, the same year Heinrich Kramer published his infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. As witch hysteria swept across Europe, the remote valleys of the Black Forest became refuge for those who practiced the old way. Wise women who knew the healing properties of foxglove and nightshade, midwives who could ease difficult births with herbs gathered under full moons, seers who read omens in the flight of ravens and the patterns of frost on winter windows. But suspicion followed them into these dark sanctuaries. In the winter of 1487, a Dominican inquisitor named Brother Matthias arrived in Schönwald, his eyes blazing with zealous fire and his saddlebags heavy with instruments of confession. The villagers whispered that he had burned 17 women in Strasbourg, and that their screams still echoed in his dreams. His target was a woman known only as Bertha die Kräuterfrau. Bertha the Herb Woman. She lived alone in a cottage built around the massive trunk of an ancient oak, its rooms carved from living wood, its windows framed by branches that bore leaves even in the deepest winter. Children came to her with fever and cough. Pregnant women sought her wisdom. Even the village priest had once begged her aid when plague threatened his flock. But Brother Matthias saw only heresy in her healing. On the feast of St. Lucia, as snow fell thick as wool, he led a procession of armed men into the Hexenwald. They found Bertha's cottage glowing from within, warm light spilling from its organic windows like liquid amber. But when they broke down her door, they found only an empty shell. The tree had grown inward, sealing itself, leaving no trace that human hands had ever carved rooms within its heartwood. Enraged, Brother Matthias ordered the oak burned. But green wood does not burn easily. And as the flames licked at the ancient bark, witnesses swore they heard screaming from within, not the cry of a woman but something older, deeper, more primal, the sound of the earth itself in agony. The fire burned for 3 days and 3 nights. When it finally died, nothing remained but a perfectly circular clearing where no grass would ever grow again. But the villagers noticed something else. In the surrounding forest, every tree bore a new mark, a spiral carved into its bark as if branded by invisible hand. And that was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the Hexenwald revealed its true nature. Travelers reported paths that led in circles, no matter how carefully they marked their way. Hunters found their quarry transformed, deer with human eyes, boars that laughed like children, wolves that spoke in forgotten tongues. And always, always, the sound of singing drifting through the mist. Women's voices raised in harmonies that predated Christ, melodies that stirred something wild and untamed in the human heart. Brother Matthias organized hunts, blessed crossbow bolts with holy water, led chanting processions deep into the woods. But the forest had its own defenses. Men would enter in groups of 10 and emerge alone, their memories fractured, speaking of dancing lights and voices that called their names. Some never emerged at all. On Walpurgisnacht, the night of April 30th, when the veil between worlds grows thin, the villagers learn to bar their doors and hang iron horseshoes above their thresholds. For this was when the Hexenwald came alive with ancient revelry. Witnesses who dared to peer through shuttered windows reported fires that burned without fuel, shadows that danced without bodies, and always at the center of it all, a figure in flowing robes, whose face was sometimes that of Bertha the herb woman, sometimes something far older and more terrible. The Inquisitor made one final attempt to cleanse the forest. On All Hallows' Eve, he led 100 armed men into the deepest grove, carrying torches blessed by the Bishop of Constance, and chanting the Te Deum in voices hoarse with righteous fury. They marched in perfect formation, a river of fire and steel flowing into the heart of darkness. At midnight, the bells of Schönewald began to toll, not the measured peals of the hour, but a frantic, chaotic clamoring as if rung by invisible hands. The entire village woke to find the sky above the forest glowing with an eerie green light, and the air filled with sounds no human throat could make. When dawn broke, the men returned, all of them, walking in perfect silence, their faces blank as fresh snow. They laid down their weapons in the village square, removed their armor, and walked naked into the forest. They were never seen again. Brother Matthias was found kneeling in the church, his hair turned white as birch bark, his eyes staring at something only he could see. When the villagers tried to speak to him, he could only whisper the same phrase over and over. Sie tanzen noch. They are still dancing. He died 3 days later, and with him died the Inquisition's power over the Hexenwald. The forest had claimed its victory, and the old ways continued in shadow and secrecy. Even today, hikers in the Schwarzwald report strange encounters in the region once known as the Hexenwald. Clearings where no trees grow, despite centuries passing. The scent of burning herbs on windless nights, and sometimes, if the moon is dark and the mist is thick, the sound of women singing ancient songs in voices that seem to rise from the very earth itself. The locals have learned to leave offerings, bundles of herbs, cups of wine, braided wheat, at the edge of these clearings, not from superstition, but from a deeper understanding that some things are older than civilization, more enduring than empires, and deserving of the respect that comes with true power. In the deepest reaches of the Odenwald, where ancient alders grow in groves so thick their canopy blocks even memory of sky, dwells a power that inspired Goethe's most haunting ballad. But the poet's tale of the Earl Koenig, the alder king who lures children to their doom, springs from encounters far more terrifying than any verse could capture. The legend reaches back to the earliest Germanic tribes, when the god Wotan led his wild hunt through storm-lashed skies, gathering the souls of warriors fallen in battle. But in the alder groves of the Black Forest, this ancient hunt took on a more sinister aspect. Here it was not heroes who were claimed, but the innocent, children whose laughter turned to screams as spectral riders bore them away into endless night. The first recorded encounter occurred in 1534, when a merchant named Johann Steinbach was traveling from Heidelberg to Stuttgart with his 8-year-old son Klaus. Night caught them on the forest road, and as mist began to rise from the marshy ground where alders grew in twisted profusion, the merchant urged his horse to greater speed, but the animal, usually fleet and responsive, began to stumble and shy, its ears laid back in terror. From his saddle, Klaus pointed into the grove. "Father," he whispered, "do you see the king? He wears a crown of stars, and his horse runs on the wind itself." Johann saw nothing but shadows and mist, but his son's voice grew high with fear and strange delight as he described the approaching figure. Tall as a tree, beautiful as moonlight on water, with eyes that held all the wild freedom of untamed places. The alder king spoke, Klaus reported, in a voice like wind through reeds, promising games and stories, golden toys and meadows where it was always spring. The merchant spurred his horse desperately, but with each stride, Klaus grew more distant, though he sat directly behind his father. His small hands, once clutched tight around Johann's waist, seemed to loosen and fade. His voice, describing the wonders the alder king promised, grew fainter, as if he were calling from across a vast distance. When Johann finally reached the lights of the next village and turned to comfort his son, he found only empty air. Klaus was gone, vanished as completely as if he had never existed. But on the merchant's cloak where the child's tears had fallen, were drops of water that sparkled with an inner light and never dried, no matter how the sun beat down upon them. The search for Klaus Steinbach continued for months. Every able-bodied man from 5 villages combed the alder groves, following paths that twisted back on themselves and calling into shadows that swallowed their voices. They found strange signs, circles of mushrooms growing in perfect spirals, trees whose bark bore the impression of small hands, pools of water that reflected not the sky above, but starfields that belonged to no earthly night. But it was an old woman of the forest, one whose grandmother had been burned as a witch, who provided the first real clue to Klaus's fate. She told the searchers of the Earl Konig's true nature, not merely a seducer of children, but a guardian of thresholds, a keeper of the boundary between the world of mortal flesh and the realm of eternal youth. "The alder grows where water meets earth," she croaked, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "It is the first tree to leaf in spring, the last to lose its crown in winter. It stands between seasons, between worlds, and the king who rules in its shadow offers children what adults have lost forever: the ability to see magic in every dewdrop, to hear music in every breeze, to believe that wishes can reshape reality. But such gifts," she warned, "came at a price. Those who followed the alder king into his realm would never age, never die, but neither would they ever return to the world of mortal concerns. They became part of the wild hunt, forever riding through storm and starlight, their laughter echoing through the centuries like the cry of nightbird." The pattern established with Klaus Steinbach repeated itself across the generations. Always, it was children who saw the alder king most clearly. Always, it was those with the strongest imagination, the purest hearts, who heard his call most distinctly. And always, their parents arrived too late to save them from a fate that might be doom or might be the greatest blessing imaginable. In 1743, a pastor's daughter named Gretchen vanished from her bed on midsummer night, leaving behind only a wreath of alder leaves and the lingering scent of wild honey. Witnesses claim to have seen her dancing in the forest clearing at midnight, surrounded by figures in flowing robes, whose faces shone with their own light. In 1802, twin brothers from the village of Eberbach
disappeared while gathering berries near the alder marsh. Their mother found their baskets overflowing with fruit that tasted of moonlight and dreams, fruit that sustained her for months without diminishing, though she ate of it daily. In 1889, during the Industrial Revolution that was transforming Germany, a factory owner's son vanished while on a hunting expedition. His companions found his rifle propped against an alder trunk, its barrel filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, silver, gold, deep purple shot through with veins of starlight. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: a child with a vivid imagination, a strong connection to the natural world, and parents who had perhaps grown too focused on the concerns of the adult world to remember the magic that surrounds us always. The Alder King, it seemed, was not merely stealing children. He was rescuing them from lives that would slowly drain away their capacity for wonder. But there were also tales of resistance, of parents whose love proved stronger than even ancient magic. In 1923, a widow named Anna Bauer pursued the wild hunt for 7 days and 7 nights when it claimed her only child, armed with nothing but a mother's desperate love
and an iron cross, blessed by Saint Boniface. She followed spectral hoofprints through groves where time flowed backward and up mountain paths that existed only in moonlight. On the 7th night, she found them, a great procession of riders moving through the sky above the alder marsh, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stars themselves. At their head rode the Alder King, beautiful and terrible, with her daughter seated before him on his phantom steed. Anna called out with a voice that carried all the anguish of mortal love, all the fierce protectiveness of a mother's heart. The wild hunt halted, and the Alder King turned to regard her with eyes like winter stars. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other, immortal magic and mortal love locked in silent struggle. Then the king smiled, an expression of infinite sadness and profound respect. He lifted the child from his saddle and set her gently on the ground. "She has chosen," he said in a voice like wind through ancient trees. "And choice is the one power even I cannot override." Anna's daughter ran to her mother's arms, but she was forever changed. Her eyes held depths that spoke of visions beyond mortal understanding. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the mist rose from the marshes, she would stand at her window and smile at things only she could see. The tale of the Earl Koenig continues to this day, though his hunting grounds have changed with the times. Urban legends speak of children who vanish from city parks where old trees grow, leaving behind only their electronic devices and strange flowers that wilt in artificial light. Social workers report cases of missing children whose parents describe them as old souls, unusually creative, often speaking of imaginary friends who seem remarkably real. Perhaps the Alder King adapts to each age, finding new ways to identify those children whose spirits are too wild for the constraints of ordinary life. Or perhaps the modern world, with its emphasis on productivity and conformity, simply produces more candidates for his eternal hunt. The groves still stand in the Black Forest, ancient alders whose roots drink from streams older than human memory. And on certain nights, when conditions are right and the boundary between worlds grows thin, travelers report seeing lights moving between the trees. Not the harsh glare of flashlights or the warm glow of camping fires, but something older, wilder, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything the modern world can produce. Listen carefully as you pass such places. If you hear the sound of children laughing in the darkness, of hooves striking the air like drums, of a voice calling in a language older than words, then you are witnessing the Alder King's eternal hunt. Whether it represents salvation or damnation depends, perhaps, on whether you remember what it means to truly wonder, to truly dream, to see magic in a world that insists such things are impossible. Beyond the villages, beyond the woodcutters' paths, beyond even the pilgrim routes that wind through the Black Forest's gentler reaches, there exists a realm that maps cannot chart and compasses cannot navigate. Here dwell the wild and Lodic, the wild folk, beings who bridge the chasm between human and nature, civilization and primal truth. These are not the diminutive sprites of children's tales, but creatures of human stature and more than human wisdom, covered in coarse hair that changes color with the seasons, brown as bark in autumn, white as snow in winter, green as new growth in spring. They move through the deepest forest with a silence that makes even the deer seem clumsy by comparison. The earliest accounts come from Charlemagne's chroniclers, who recorded encounters with homines sylvestres during the emperor's campaigns against the Saxon tribes. Soldiers reported glimpsing tall, shaggy figures watching from the treeline during battles, neither joining the conflict nor fleeing from it, but observing with an intensity that spoke of profound intelligence. These beings seemed to understand that they were witnessing the collision of two worlds, the old forest realm and the new Christian kingdom, and were perhaps deciding which they would ultimately serve. But it was not until the 13th century that the wild folk emerged from the realm of military reports into the heart of folklore. The chronicler known only as Brother Heinrich of St. Jürgen recorded the first detailed encounter, based on the testimony of a hermit monk, who claimed to have lived among them for 3 years. Brother Aldrich had fled to the forest to escape the corruption he perceived in monastery life during the papal schism. Seeking a life of pure contemplation, he built a simple shelter of woven branches deep in the Schwarzwald, intending to sustain himself on berries and stream water while devoting his days to prayer and meditation. But the forest had other plans for him. On his third night in the wilderness, Aldrich was awakened by a sound he could not identify. Not quite music, not quite language, but something that seemed to combine the two in harmonies that made his soul ache with longing. Following the sound deeper into the forest, he came upon a clearing, where massive stones formed a natural amphitheater, and there he witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A gathering of the wild folk surrounded a spring that bubbled up from the earth's depths, its water catching and reflecting light that seemed to come from no earthly source. The beings, he counted perhaps 20, were engaged in what could only be called worship, but not of any god recognized by Christian theology. They sang to the forest itself, to the ancient spirits that dwelt in root and branch, stone and Their leader, a figure even taller than the rest with hair like silver moonlight and eyes that held the deep green of old-growth forest, noticed the monk's presence immediately, but instead of fleeing or threatening, she simply beckoned him forward with a gesture that combined invitation and command. What followed, according to Aldrich's account, was an education in truths that no monastery could teach. The wild folk, he learned, were the original inhabitants of these forests, beings who had lived here when the world was young and the boundary between matter and spirit was far more fluid than it had since become. They were not exactly human, nor were they entirely other. They existed in the spaces between categories, the liminal realm, where transformation was always possible. Under their tutelage, Aldrich learned to read the forest's moods in the behavior of birds, to find healing herbs by following the scent patterns that drifted on evening breezes, to understand the complex relationships that bound all forest life in webs of mutual dependence. More importantly, he learned that consciousness itself was not limited to human beings, but flowed through all creation in an endless dance of awareness and response. The wild folk showed him sacred groves, where particular trees served as oracles, their rustling leaves conveying messages from deeper realms of being. They taught him to recognize the signs that indicated when a place was ready to reveal its secrets, and how to approach such revelations with the proper mixture of respect and wonder. They demonstrated methods of shape-shifting that allowed them to take on the forms of animals when the need arose, not through magic as Christian theology understood it, but through a fundamental recognition of the unity underlying all apparent diversity. But perhaps most profoundly, they shared with him their understanding of time. For the wild folk, past and future were artificial constructs that obscured the eternal present moment in which all true life occurred. They showed him places in the forest where history layered upon itself like tree rings, where he could witness the passage of Germanic tribes, the arrival of Roman legions, the building of the first Christian churches, and the gradual retreat of the old gods into ever deeper wilderness. In one such place, a valley where an ancient stone circle stood surrounded by yews older than human memory, Aldrich experienced what he could only describe as a vision of the forest's true nature. He saw it not as a collection of individual trees and animals, but as a single living entity of unimaginable complexity and intelligence. Each leaf was a thought, each root a memory, each stream a nerve carrying information through a continental mind that had been awakening slowly for millions of years. For 3 years, Aldrich lived this transformed existence,
learning lessons that prepared him for insights no Christian theology could accommodate. He learned that the wild folk were not beings separate from the forest, but expressions of its consciousness, avatars through which it could interact with the human world. They were simultaneously ancient beyond measure and eternally young, existing in a perpetual state of becoming that never resolved into fixed being. But all transformations have their price. As Aldrich's understanding deepened, he began to change as well. His hair grew long and took on the color of autumn leaves. His skin became rough as bark. His eyes deep as forest pools. Most importantly, his connection to the human world began to fade like a half-remembered dream. It was the wild folk themselves who recognized the danger. Their leader, whom Aldrich had come to know as Berchta, a name that echoed through Germanic mythology, explained that he stood at a crossroads. He could complete his transformation and join them permanently, becoming another expression of the forest's awakening consciousness, or he could return to the human world, carrying with him the knowledge he had gained but also the burden of living between worlds. The choice, she emphasized, was his alone, but she warned him that either path would bring its own form of suffering. To stay would mean abandoning his human identity forever. To leave would mean spending the rest of his life as a bridge between realms, understood fully by neither. Aldrich chose to return, driven by a sense of mission he could not fully articulate. The wild folk received his decision with neither surprise nor disappointment. They had known. They told him from the moment he first entered their clearing what choice he would ultimately make. They blessed him with gifts that would aid his return to human society. The ability to find his way through any forest, no matter how dense or unmarked. The skill to identify and use healing plants even in unfamiliar territories. And most importantly, the capacity to recognize others who had touched the deeper mysteries, who might be ready to hear at least fragments of what he had learned. His return to civilization was traumatic. The monastery walls seemed like a prison after 3 years of limitless forest. The routine of canonical hours felt artificial compared to the natural rhythms he had learned to follow. Worst of all, when he tried to share his experiences with his fellow monks, they branded him a heretic and threatened him with excommunication. It was only through the intervention of Brother Heinrich, the chronicler who would eventually record his story, that Aldrich escaped formal charges of apostasy. Heinrich recognized in the hermit's account, not blasphemy, but a form of revelation that transcended traditional theological category. He arranged for Aldrich to be transferred to a remote monastery, where his unconventional insights could be preserved without threatening church orthodoxy. But Aldrich's story was far from over. The gifts granted by the wild folk continued to manifest throughout his life. He became renowned as a healer, able to cure ailments that baffled even the most learned physicians. More mysteriously, he seemed to age at a different rate than his contemporaries, maintaining vigor and clarity of mind well into what should have been extreme old age. When he finally died at the age of 93, remarkably ancient for the 13th century, witnesses reported that his body showed none of the decay typical of human death. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into earth and root, becoming one with the forest floor in a process that left behind only a circle of unusually fertile soil where wildflowers bloomed with extraordinary beauty. The influence of Aldrich's account rippled through the centuries, inspiring other seekers to venture into the deep forest in search of the wild folk. Most returned empty-handed, having encountered only ordinary wildlife and natural phenomena, but a few, always those who approached with the proper combination of humility and openness, reported experiences that echoed Aldrich's own. In the 15th century, a traveling scholar named Johannes Trithemius documented several such encounters, describing them as evidence of what he called Sylvan theology, a form of divine revelation that came not through scripture or church tradition, but through direct communion with the natural world. His writings influenced the development of natural philosophy, and contributed to the growing tension between scientific observation and religious orthodoxy, that would eventually culminate in the Enlightenment. During the Romantic period, tales of the wild folk experienced a revival as poets and artists sought alternatives to the rationalism that dominated intellectual life. Novalis wrote of green men, who appeared to him during solitary walks in the Harz Mountains, sharing insights that influenced his concept of magical idealism. Caspar David Friedrich's paintings of solitary figures in vast landscapes were, according to his private journals, inspired by encounters with beings who seemed to emerge from the forests themselves. Even in the modern era, reports continue to surface from the deepest regions of the Black Forest. Hikers describe glimpses of tall, hair-covered figures moving through the trees with impossible grace. Environmental researchers working in protected areas report finding evidence of intelligence in the forest that seems to exceed what current ecological theory can explain. Patterns of plant growth that suggest conscious cultivation, animal behaviors that indicate forms of interspecies communication, and most puzzling of all, areas where the forest appears to be actively healing damage caused by human activity at rates that should be impossible given current understanding of natural process. Perhaps most intriguingly, several modern environmental philosophers have developed theories that echo Aldrich's ancient insights. They speak of forest consciousness and ecological intelligence, proposing that large natural systems may possess forms of awareness that operate on scales and timelines far beyond human comprehension. While they use scientific language rather than the mystical terminology of medieval accounts, their descriptions of interconnected forest networks, sharing information through fungal networks, and chemical signals sound remarkably similar to the wild folks' teachings about the forest as a single living entity. The question remains, are the Wilden Lodet literal beings who continue to inhabit the deepest reaches of Germany's forests, or are they metaphorical representations of humanity's relationship with the natural world, symbols of the wisdom we abandoned when we chose civilization over wildness? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these interpretations, but in recognizing that they may not be mutually exclusive. In a universe where consciousness itself remains one of the greatest mysteries, where quantum physics suggests that observation shapes reality, and where ecological science reveals connections and communications in nature that our ancestors
intuited but could not prove, the boundary between metaphor and reality becomes far less certain. What remains constant across the centuries is the human need for connection with something larger than ourselves, something wilder and wiser than the constructs of civilization. Whether we call it God, nature, or the wild folk may matter less than our willingness to venture beyond the safe boundaries of the known world and encounter mystery on its own terms. The paths still exist, leading from the marked trails into the deep forest, where maps become useless and compasses spin aimlessly. The clearings still wait, surrounded by stones that predate human history and springs that bubble up from depths that science has had to fathom. And sometimes, if you approach with the right combination of reverence and courage, you might glimpse something moving in the shadows between the trees, something that reminds you that consciousness is far stranger and more wonderful than human concepts can contain. Where forest roads cross in the heart of the Schwarzwald, where four paths converge under the twisted arms of ancient oaks, there stands a figure that travelers have feared for over 1,000 years. Not a man of flesh and blood, but something far older and more dangerous, der Schwarze Mann, the black man of the crossroads, whose bargains have shaped the destiny of nations and whose prices are always higher than they first appear. He is known by many names across the German lands, der Teufel am Kreuzweg, der Schwarze Jäger, der Meister des Waldes. But whatever name men give him, his nature remains constant. He is the dark mirror of human ambition, the shadow that follows every dream of power, the price that must be paid for shortcuts to greatness. Unlike the Christian devil of theological imagination, the black man predates the arrival of Christianity in Germany by centuries. Celtic druids knew him as the Dark Hunter, the god of the spaces between spaces, the ruler of thresholds and transition. Germanic tribes called him Wode's shadow, the dark aspect of their chief god, the part of Wotan that dealt in curses rather than blessings. When Christianity swept across Europe, these ancient powers did not disappear. They retreated to the margins, to the places where certainty faltered and old fears held sway. The first recorded encounter with the black man dates to 8047 CE, during the reign of Louis the German. A monk named Brother Ansgar, traveling from the monastery of St. Gallen to establish a new abbey in the Schwarzwald, found himself lost as darkness fell over the forest roads. Following what appeared to be lamplight in the distance, he came upon a crossroads, where four paths met beneath an oak so ancient its trunk required 20 men linking arms to encircle it. There, seated on a throne carved from the living wood, sat a figure dressed in robes that seemed woven from shadow itself. His face was neither young nor old but timeless, with features that shifted subtly as Brother Ansgar watched, sometimes appearing as a nobleman of obvious refinement, sometimes as a peasant weathered by years of toil, sometimes as something that was not quite human at all. "Lost, brother?" the figure asked in a voice like distant thunder. "The paths through this wood are treacherous, especially for those who carry such heavy burdens." Brother Ansgar clutched his leather satchel closer to his chest. Within it lay the charter for his new abbey, signed by Louis himself, and a purse of gold sufficient to purchase land and begin construction. More importantly, it contained relics, said to possess miraculous power. A fragment of the true cross, a strand of hair from Saint Martin of Tours, and a vial of oil that had touched the bones of Saint Peter himself. "I am not lost," the monk replied, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "I follow God's path, and he shall guide me safely to my destination." The black man smiled, an expression that carried neither warmth nor cruelty, but something far more unsettling, genuine amusement. "Your God is welcome in these woods, brother, but he is not the only power that dwells here, and his paths are not the only ones that lead to desired destinations." What followed was a conversation that would haunt Brother Ansgar for the rest of his days. The black man spoke of the abbey the monk planned to build, describing its location with accuracy that should have been impossible, outlining its future with clarity that suggested either supernatural knowledge or the power to shape events through will alone. "You will build your abbey," the figure said, "and it will stand for centuries, a beacon of faith in this dark wood. But the cost will be higher than you imagine. The local lord will resist your presence, bandits will prey upon your workers, disease will strike your community, winter will come early and stay late. Many will die before your dream takes root." However, the black man continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more clearly than his normal tones, "There is another way. I can ensure your abbey's success. The Lord will welcome you as a brother. Workers will come in great numbers, skilled craftsmen eager to labor for modest wages. The weather will favor your construction. Your community will prosper beyond your wildest hopes." Brother Ansgar felt temptation stir in his heart despite his training. The lives that could be saved, the souls that could be shepherded to salvation, the glory that would redound to God's name. Surely these worthy ends justified almost any means. "What would you require in return?" he asked, already knowing he had taken the first step toward damnation. The black man's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished obsidian. "Nothing you will miss, brother, nothing you truly need. Simply this. When you ring the abbey's bell for the first time, when you call the faithful to their initial service in your new sanctuary, remember that not all prayers are heard by the same ears. Some invocations echo in deeper chambers, where older powers hold court." The monk's training warred with his desire. He knew he stood at a crossroads, in more than the physical sense. This was a moment that would define not only his own soul but the spiritual character of the institution he hoped to create. Yet the promise of success without suffering, of accomplishment without sacrifice, proved too tempting to resist. "I accept," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water. The moment he spoke, the forest changed around him. The crossroads transformed from a simple intersection into something that resembled a Gothic cathedral more than a forest clearing. The ancient oak stretched upward until its branches disappeared into a canopy that seemed to extend infinitely into star-filled darkness. The black man's throne became an altar of black stone, carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to contemplate directly. From this altar, the black man produced a contract written on parchment that appeared to be made from human skin. The text was in Latin, but a Latin that predated the church, words that carried meanings the monk understood without quite knowing how he acquired such knowledge. "Sign here," the black man instructed, offering a quill that was either carved from bone or was itself a bone, hollow and filled with ink that moved of its own accord. "And your abbey will rise as promised." Brother Ansgar signed, and the contract burst into flames that gave off no heat but filled the air with the scent of burning roses. When the fire died, nothing remained but ash that scattered on a wind that touched nothing else in the clearing. "It is done," the black man said, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "Build your abbey, brother, ring your bell. Gather your faithful, but remember,
Every prayer offered within those walls will carry a double echo. Every soul you shepherd toward salvation will also acknowledge the older shepherds who ruled these hills before your God was even imagined. The clearing returned to normal, so suddenly that Brother Ansgar wondered if he had experienced a vision rather than a genuine encounter. But when he checked his satchel, he found something that convinced him of the experience's reality. Alongside his original documents lay another charter, this one bearing the seal of the local lord and granting him not only permission to build, but active assistance in the construction. The Abbey of Sancti Schwarzwald rose exactly as the black man had promised. The local lord provided land, materials, and protection. Skilled craftsmen arrived from across the German lands, drawn by wages that seemed modest but somehow proved sufficient to support entire families. The weather favored construction throughout the building season. No accidents befell the workers, no disease struck the growing community. Within 3 years the abbey was complete, a magnificent structure of local sandstone that seemed to grow organically from the forest floor, its bell tower reaching toward heaven, while its foundations extended deep into earth that had been sacred long before Christian feet walked upon it. But Brother Ansgar, now Abbot Ansgar, began to notice disturbing details as his dream reached fulfillment. The stone carvings around the abbey's main entrance, which he had personally approved, incorporated symbols that belonged to no Christian tradition he could identify. The acoustics of the main chapel were extraordinary, carrying whispered prayers to every corner of the sanctuary. But they also seemed to carry those prayers somewhere else, to listeners the abbot preferred not to contemplate. Most troubling of all were the moments during services when the congregation's attention would suddenly shift, as if responding to words he had not spoken or music he had not ordered played. At such times their faces would take on expressions of rapture that seemed to transcend any emotion proper Christian worship should evoke. The abbey's success continued to grow. Pilgrims came from across Europe to experience what they described as the most spiritually powerful sanctuary in the German lands. The library expanded rapidly as scribes felt inspired to produce illuminated manuscripts of unprecedented beauty and theological sophistication. The abbey's herb gardens yielded medicines that seemed to cure ailments beyond the reach of ordinary remedies. Yet with each triumph, Abbot Ansgar felt the weight of his bargain more heavily. He began to understand that the black man had not simply ensured the abbey's material success, he had fundamentally altered its spiritual character. The institution served God, yes, but it served other powers as well, older authorities whose influence grew stronger with each passing year. The crisis came on the abbey's 10th anniversary, during the celebration of its founding. As Abbot Ansgar raised the Eucharist during the morning service, preparing to offer the body and blood of Christ to his congregation, he noticed that the wine in the chalice had turned completely black, not the deep red of normal sacramental wine, but black as midnight, black as the robes of the figure who had made his success possible. The congregation waited, their upturned faces filled with expectation that went beyond ordinary religious hunger. In that moment, Abbot Ansgar realized that they knew, perhaps they had always known, the spiritual power that drew them to this place was not entirely Christian, and they had come to participate in mysteries that predated the cross by millennia. He faced a choice that mirrored the one he had made at the crossroads a decade earlier. He could complete the service as planned, offering the transformed wine to his congregation and acknowledging openly the dual nature of the abbey's spiritual authority, or he could refuse, breaking his compact with the black man and accepting whatever consequences such defiance might bring. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Abbot Ansgar stood frozen at the altar, the black chalice heavy in his trembling hand. Then, with a prayer for forgiveness that he was not sure God would hear, he raised the cup to his own lips and drank deeply. The wine tasted of earth and shadow, of ancient rituals performed under stars that had died before human civilization began. As it flowed down his throat, Abbot Ansgar felt his connection to the divine change, expanding to encompass powers and principalities that Orthodox theology insisted were demons, but that revealed themselves to be something far more complex, aspects of creation itself, older than good and evil, operating according to laws that preceded moral categories. The abbey continued to prosper for another century, becoming one of the most influential monasteries in the German lands. Its theological innovations influenced the development of mystical Christianity throughout Europe. Its library preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost to barbarian invasions and the collapse of classical civilization. Its medical innovations saved thousands of lives and advanced human understanding of natural healing. But those who knew its history understood that such achievements came at a price. Every night, when the bells rang for Compline, they carried their call not only to Christian ears, but to listeners in the deep forest, who remembered when worship took different forms and spoke different names. Every prayer offered within the abbey's walls ascended to heaven, but it also descended to older temples, carved into the earth itself, where powers stirred that had shaped human destiny since consciousness first recognized its own mortality. When the abbey was finally destroyed during the 30 Years' War, witnesses reported that it did not burn like ordinary buildings. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into shadow, its stones flowing like water back into the earth from which they had been quarried. The site remained barren for decades afterward, despite efforts to cultivate crops or rebuild structures. Local peasants reported that the crossroads where the black man had first appeared had expanded, with paths now leading in directions that existed on no earthly map. The legend of Der Schwarze Mann continues to evolve with each generation, adapting to new fears and desires, while maintaining its essential character. During the Industrial Revolution, he appeared to factory owners and railroad barons, offering success in exchange for considerations that seemed minor until the bills came due. In the 20th century, politicians and generals found him waiting at crucial moments, promising victory to those willing to pay prices that were always higher than they appeared. Modern urban legends speak of technology executives, who encounter him in server farms that sprawl beneath ancient forests, offering quantum leaps in artificial intelligence, or breakthrough discoveries in renewable energy. Environmental scientists report meeting him at climate research stations built on former sacred groves, where he promises solutions to ecological crises that require only small compromises with principles that once seemed non-negotiable. But the crossroads still exist in the Black Forest, still wait for travelers whose ambitions exceed their wisdom. The ancient oak still spreads its branches over paths that lead to destinations marked on no GPS system. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the forest floor like the breath of sleeping giants, a figure still takes his seat on the throne carved from living wood, patient as stone, offering bargains that reshape the world one soul at a time.
The question each generation must answer is not whether such powers exist. That question answers itself in the dark hours when conscience battles with ambition and expedience wars with principle. The real question is whether we possess the wisdom to recognize when we stand at our own crossroads, when the choices we make will echo through centuries we will never live to see. For in the end, the black man offers nothing that does not already exist within human hearts. He is the shadow we cast when we reach for power without considering its costs, the price we pay when we choose the easy path over the righteous one. His greatest trick is not tempting us toward evil, but convincing us that the evil we choose serves a greater good. The paths still converge in the heart of the Black Forest. The ancient oak still spreads its branches over ground that has been sacred for millennia, and the choice still waits for each of us, as it has waited for every generation since humans learned to want more than they could rightfully claim. In the ruins of Hohennegold Castle, perched on a precipice that overlooks the deepest valleys of the Black Forest, she appears at the stroke of midnight when the moon wanes toward darkness. Die Weiße Frau, the White Lady, glides through chambers where no living soul has walked for 3 centuries, her mourning dress trailing behind her like captured mist, her pale hands reaching toward something that exists only in memory. She is the most tragic figure in all the pantheon of forest spirits, for unlike the others, she was once entirely human. Her transformation from flesh to phantom came not through ancient magic or divine curse, but through the most mortal of agonies, a love betrayed, a trust shattered, and a grief so profound it tore holes in the fabric of reality itself. The tale begins in 1547, during the tumultuous years of the Schmalkaldic War, when Protestant and Catholic forces carved Germany into a patchwork of conflicting loyalties. Lord Magnus von Nagold, a man whose ambitions exceeded his principles, ruled the castle with an iron hand and a calculating mind. His wealth came from controlling the trade routes that wound through the Black Forest, and his power rested on his ability to play both sides against each other while enriching himself through their conflict. But Magnus had one vulnerability that threatened to undermine his carefully constructed empire. His daughter Bertha, whose beauty was matched only by her compassion, whose gentle heart refused to recognize the brutal necessities her father considered essential to survival. Bertha von Nagold had been raised in luxury but educated in virtue. While her father schemed with merchants and mercenaries, she spent her days caring for the sick and wounded, regardless of their religious or political affiliations. Her chambers had been converted into an infirmary where Catholic and Protestant soldiers lay side by side, tended by the same gentle hands, comforted by the same soft voice. It was this very compassion that brought Friedrich von Liechtenstein into her life. A knight in service to the Protestant League, he had been gravely wounded during the siege of Mühlberg and left for dead on the battlefield. Bertha's servants found him unconscious in a ravine, more ghost than man, and brought him to the castle under cover of darkness. For weeks, Friedrich hovered between life and death while Bertha nursed him with a devotion that transcended duty. She sat by his bedside through fever dreams that made him cry out in languages she did not recognize. She fed him broths prepared from herbs she gathered in the castle's moonlit gardens. Most importantly, she listened as delirium loosened his tongue and revealed glimpses of a soul that had been as wounded by war as his body. Friedrich was not merely a soldier but a scholar, a man who had taken up arms reluctantly in defense of religious principles he genuinely believed served God's will. He spoke of cities reduced to rubble by Christian fighting Christian, of children orphaned by men who claimed to serve the Prince of Peace. His dreams were haunted not by fear of death but by guilt over the lives he had taken in service to causes that seemed increasingly meaningless as the war dragged on. As Friedrich's strength returned, so did his ability to engage Bertha in conversations that ranged far beyond the immediate circumstances of his recovery. They spoke of theology and philosophy, of poetry and music, of dreams for a world where differences in doctrine would not require differences in blood. In his presence, Bertha discovered intellectual depths she had never known she possessed. In her company, Friedrich found peace that no prayer had ever provided. Love, when it came, seemed as natural as sunrise after the longest night, but both lovers knew that their feelings existed in defiance of realities that brooked no sentiment. Friedrich was Protestant, Bertha Catholic. He served the League. She was the daughter of a man who had grown wealthy by playing all sides against each other. Their love was not merely star-crossed but politically explosive, capable of destroying both their houses and everyone they held dear. Lord Magnus discovered the relationship through means that history has not recorded, perhaps through servants' gossip, perhaps through his own network of spies. His reaction was swift and merciless. Friedrich was arrested in the pre-dawn hours, charged with espionage and sentenced to death before he fully regained consciousness. But Magnus's cruelty extended beyond simple execution. He arranged for Friedrich to be hanged from the castle's highest tower at sunset, positioned so that his dying body would be visible from Bertha's chamber window. More than this, he commanded his daughter to watch, posting guards to ensure she could not turn away or close her eyes during her lover's final moments. What followed was a scene that burned itself into the memory of everyone present and echoed through the centuries in folk songs and whispered tales. As the sun touched the western mountains and Friedrich was led to the scaffold, Bertha appeared at her window dressed in white, the mourning color of noble houses, but also the color of bridal gowns, as if she were simultaneously grieving and celebrating some mystical union that transcended death. She stood motionless as the noose was placed around Friedrich's neck, her face pale as carved marble but her eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the hardened soldiers look away. When the trap was sprung and Friedrich's body jerked once before hanging still, a sound emerged from Bertha's throat that witnesses would describe for the rest of their lives as less than human and more than human, a wail that seemed to tear the air itself and leave wounds in reality that would never fully heal. The sound continued long after Friedrich's body had been cut down and removed, long after sunset faded into night. It echoed through the castle corridors like wind through a broken organ, rising and falling in harmonies that spoke of loss too great for any single voice to contain.
Servants who had worked in the castle for decades found themselves unable to bear the sound and fled into the forest, preferring the uncertainty of wild beasts to the certainty of grief so profound it had taken on a life of its own. Lord Magnus, perhaps finally recognizing the magnitude of what he had unleashed, went to his daughter's chamber and found it empty. The window stood open, white curtains billowing in the night breeze like funeral shrouds. On the sill lay Bertha's jewelry, and the key to her private chapel, but of the woman herself there was no trace. The search that followed lasted for weeks and involved every able-bodied man in the region. They combed the forest paths, dragged the mountain streams, explored caves that honeycombed the limestone cliffs beneath the castle. But Bertha von Nagold had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the memory of that terrible wail and a mystery that would haunt the Black Forest for centuries to come. It was exactly 1 year later that the White Lady first appeared. Castle guards reported seeing a figure in flowing white robes walking the battlements at midnight, pausing at the spot where Friedrich had died before gliding back toward the residential tower. The apparition made no sound and responded to no challenge, but her presence was so palpable that guards found themselves stepping aside to let her pass, though she never acknowledged their existence. As months passed, her appearances became more frequent and more elaborate. She was seen in the chapel, kneeling before the altar with her head bowed in prayer that produced no sound but somehow filled the sacred space with an atmosphere of mourning so intense that flowers wilted and candles guttered despite the absence of any breeze. She appeared in the garden where she had once gathered healing herbs, her pale hands reaching toward plants that had grown wild and strange in her absence, as if responding to her ghostly touch by evolving into forms that served no earthly purpose. Most disturbing of all were her visits to the chamber where Friedrich had recovered from his wound. Servants who dared to peer through the keyhole reported seeing her seated beside the empty bed, her lips moving in conversations with someone only she could see, her face animated by expressions of joy and sorrow that flickered like candlelight in a drafty room. Lord Magnus, his power broken by guilt and his health shattered by sleepless nights, died within 3 years of his daughter's disappearance. With his death, the castle's fortunes collapsed entirely. Trade routes shifted to avoid the region where the White Lady walked. Merchants reported being followed by a figure in mourning dress who appeared at the edge of their vision but vanished when approached directly. Soldiers assigned to garrison duty requested transfers after experiencing dreams in which a pale woman stood at the foot of their beds, weeping tears that fell like acid onto their soul. By 1600, Hohenzollern Castle had been completely abandoned, left to the forest and the spirits that claimed such desolate places. The White Lady continued her vigil through decades that became centuries, her appearances now witnessed only by travelers who lost their way in the deep woods and stumbled upon the ruins by accident. Their accounts, recorded in parish registers and local chronicles, revealed that Bertha's ghost had evolved far beyond a simple revenant. She had become something like a force of nature, a personification of love that transcends death and grief that reshapes reality. Those who encountered her reported experiences that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of life and death, time and eternity. Some visitors claimed to have witnessed not just the White Lady but spectral reenactments of her entire tragic story. They watched phantom scenes play out in the ruined Great Hall, Lord Magnus plotting with shadowy advisors, Friedrich lying wounded while Bertha tended his injuries, the terrible execution witnessed by the woman whose love had crossed all boundaries only to be destroyed by political expedient. Others reported more interactive encounters. Lost travelers found themselves guided through the forest by a figure in white who led them to safety without ever speaking a word. Wounded soldiers hiding in the ruins during various conflicts discovered their injuries mysteriously healed after falling asleep to the sound of someone singing lullabies in a voice like wind through silver bells. But perhaps the most significant encounters involved couples whose own love faced seemingly impossible obstacles. Throughout the centuries, men and women whose relationships challenged social conventions, religious differences, or political divides reported being drawn to the ruins of Hohenzollern Castle by dreams they could not explain. There in the White Lady's presence, they experienced visions that showed them possible futures, some tragic, some triumphant, all shaped by choices they had yet to make. The phantom Bertha seemed to serve as a guide for lovers who stood where she had once stood, helping them understand both the power and the price of love that refuses to be constrained by worldly consideration. Many of these couples credited the White Lady with helping them find ways to overcome the obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. They spoke of receiving insights during their encounters that enabled them to navigate complex family dynamics, negotiate religious differences, or find compromises that preserved both love and honor. Some claimed that the White Lady had literally appeared at crucial moments in their courtships, intervening in ways that seemed impossible but produced results that could not be denied. Yet others told darker tales. They reported that the White Lady had shown them visions of what awaited couples whose love demanded too high a price, images of families destroyed, communities torn apart, innocent people caught in the crossfire of passions that burned too bright to be safely contained. These visitors left Hohenegald Castle convinced that some loves, however genuine, were too dangerous to pursue. The White Lady's influence extended beyond individual encounters to shape the broader folklore of the region. She became a patron saint of impossible love, a figure to whom the lovelorn prayed when conventional religion offered no comfort. Young women facing arranged marriages they could not bear would sometimes disappear into the Black Forest, seeking the ruins where Bertha's spirit might grant them either the courage to resist or the peace to accept their fate. During the Napoleonic Wars, when foreign soldiers occupied the German lands and local women faced choices between survival and honor, the White Lady's legend took on new dimensions. She was said to appear to women who were contemplating suicide rather than submit to unwanted advances, offering them alternatives they had not considered. Hidden paths through the forest, sanctuaries where they could wait out the occupation, or sometimes simply the strength to endure what could not be avoided. The rise of Romanticism in the 19th century brought new visitors to Hohenegald Castle, artists and poets who sought inspiration from communion with a spirit who had embodied the romantic ideal of love that transcends all earthly limitation. Many claimed that encounters with the White Lady had profoundly influenced their work, inspiring poems and paintings that captured aspects of human experience that rational discourse could never convey. Richard Wagner reportedly visited the ruins while composing Tristan und Isolde, seeking to understand how love and death could be so intimately connected that they became aspects of a single reality. Heinrich Heine wrote of meeting a figure in white who spoke to him of the difference between love as a human emotion and love as a cosmic force that shapes the fundamental structure of reality. But it was the 20th century that brought the most profound transformation in the White Lady's legend. As two world wars devastated Europe and traditional social structures crumbled, her story evolved to address new forms of impossible love, relationships that crossed racial boundaries in an age of genocidal hatred, connections that transcended national borders when nationalism had become a murderous madness, bonds that persisted despite ideological differences that literally divided the world. During World War II, the ruins of Hohenegald Castle became a secret meeting place for resistance members whose activities required absolute discretion. They reported that the White
Lady's presence somehow protected their gatherings from discovery, that Nazi patrols would approach the ruins but then inexplicably turn away, as if something prevented them from seeing what was directly before their eyes. After the war, as Germany struggled to rebuild not just its cities, but its moral foundation, the White Lady became a symbol of reconciliation. Her story was reinterpreted as a parable about the futility of hatred and the ultimate triumph of love over political divisions. Couples separated by the Berlin Wall reported dreams in which a woman in white showed them hidden paths through the barrier, reuniting them in ways that seemed impossible but later proved achievable through patient persistence and creative problem solving. Today, in an age when global communication has made the world simultaneously more connected and more divided, the White Lady of Hohenegald Castle continues to evolve. Urban legends speak of her appearing in online forums where people discuss impossible relationships, offering cryptic advice that sometimes proves remarkably practical. Dating apps report glitches that seem to connect users whose profiles should never have crossed paths, bringing together people whose love stories echo the themes of Bertha's eternal vigil. Environmental activists working to preserve the Black Forest claim that the White Lady has become a guardian of the wilderness itself, protecting sacred groves from development, and ensuring that places of power remain accessible to those who need them most. They report finding white flowers blooming in clearings where no such species should be able to survive, and discovering springs of fresh water in locations where geological surveys insist none should exist. The ruins of Hothenagold Castle still crown their precipice above the Black Forest, though centuries of weather have reduced the once mighty walls to fragmentary teeth against the sky. But visitors continue to make the difficult climb to the summit, drawn by stories that adapt to each generation while maintaining their essential truth, that love, once genuine, never truly dies, but continues to influence the world in ways that skeptical minds struggle to explain. On certain nights, when the moon wanes toward darkness and mist rises from the valley floors, she still appears. Die weise Frau, eternal in her vigil, immortal in her grief. Her story reminds us that some forces in human experience transcend the boundaries of life and death, that love, authentic enough, can reshape reality itself, and that tragedy, when embraced rather than denied, sometimes becomes the foundation for miracles that no amount of rational analysis can adequately explain. Whether the White Lady exists as literal ghost or metaphorical truth matters less than what her presence teaches those who encounter her legend. In a world where love often seems impossible, where differences divide us more than similarities unite us, where the price of genuine connection can seem too high to pay, she offers both warning and hope. Warning that some paths lead to sorrow beyond meaning, hope that some loves prove stronger than death itself. The vigil continues, the love endures, and in the ruins of what was once a symbol of earthly power, something eternal keeps watch, reminding us that the human heart, when it truly opens, contains mysteries that no amount of cynicism can fully close. As our journey through Germany's darkest legends draws to its close, we find ourselves standing once again at the edge of the Schwarzwald, where civilization meets mystery and the familiar world gives way to realms that maps cannot chart. Behind us lie the paths we have walked together, through Witches' Hollow where justice burns eternal, past alder groves where the wild hunt still rides, into depths where ancient spirits continue their patient watch over secrets older than human memory. But these tales, haunting as they are, represent only fragments of a vast tapestry that stretches across the German landscape and deep into the German soul. For the Black Forest is not merely a geographical feature, but a state of consciousness, a recognition that reality contains depths and dimensions that rational thought alone cannot fathom. The legends we have explored tonight spring from humanity's most profound encounters with the unknown, moments when the ordinary world cracks open to reveal the extraordinary forces that shape our destiny from beyond the reach of everyday awareness. They are not simply stories told to frighten children or entertain adults, but encoded memories of genuine encounters with powers that exist in the spaces between the categories our minds use to organize experience. Each legend carries within it a grain of truth that transcends the specific details of its telling. The Hexenwald reminds us that there are forms of wisdom that official institutions cannot contain or control, that the persecution of alternative ways of knowing often springs from fear rather than righteousness. The Erlkönig warns us that the desire to preserve innocence can sometimes prevent us from recognizing when innocence chooses its own transformation. The wild folk teach us that consciousness may be far more widely distributed throughout creation than our human-centered worldview usually admits. Der Schwarze Mann shows us the shadow side of human ambition, the price that must always be paid when we seek shortcuts to power without considering the full cost of our choices. The White Lady demonstrates that love, when genuine, possesses a reality that transcends physical death and continues to influence the world in ways that pure materialism cannot explain. These are not comfortable truths, but they are necessary ones. In an age when technology promises to solve every problem and science claims to explain every mystery, the Black Forest legends serve as a reminder that human experience encompasses realities that resist reduction to digital data or laboratory analysis. They point toward aspects of existence that can only be approached through story, symbol, and direct encounter with the Numen. The Germany that gave birth to these legends was a land of deep forests and deeper mysteries, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained fluid and permeable. Modern Germany has largely paved over these mysteries, replacing sacred groves with industrial complexes and ancient pilgrimage routes with superhighways. Yet the legends persist,
adapting to new contexts while maintaining their essential wisdom. Today's encounters with the unexplained may occur in server farms built over former sacred sites, in research laboratories where quantum mechanics reveals reality to be far stranger than classical physics ever imagined, in virtual worlds where consciousness explores territories that exist only as information but feel more real than anything material. The forms change, but the fundamental human need to grapple with mystery remains constant. The Black Forest still stands, though greatly reduced from its ancient extent. Within its remaining depths, hikers and researchers continue to report experiences that echo the old legends, encounters with presences that cannot be photographed or recorded but leave impressions that last lifetime. Whether these represent objective phenomena or projections of the human psyche matters less than their function in reminding us that reality contains more wonders than our normal modes of perception usually reveal. Perhaps the greatest lesson of these dark German legends is that fear and wonder are not opposite emotions, but complementary aspects of a single response to the sacred. The beings we have encountered tonight, witches and wild folk, spectral hunters and mourning ladies, inspire terror not because they are evil but because they are powerful, not because they threaten us, but because they remind us how small and vulnerable we are in the face of forces beyond our control or comprehension. Yet this same terror, when met with courage and openness, transforms into awe. The witch becomes a guardian of ancient wisdom. The wild hunt becomes a reminder of freedom that civilization cannot fully tame. The mourning spirit becomes a testament to love's power to transcend death itself. This transformation, from fear to wonder, from terror to reverence, lies at the heart of all genuine spiritual experience. The Black Forest legends have endured for centuries because they encode this transformation in stories that speak to the deepest levels of human consciousness, below the reach of rational analysis, but accessible to anyone willing to venture beyond the safe boundaries of the known world. The paths still exist, winding through what remains of the ancient woodland, leading to clearings where starlight falls on stones older than history. The invitation still stands, whispered on winds that carry the scent of pine and possibility. Whether you accept that invitation depends on your willingness to acknowledge that the world contains mysteries worthy of a lifetime's exploration. The Black Forest keeps its secrets, but it also shares them with those who approach with the proper combination of respect and courage. The legends continue, evolving with each telling while maintaining their essential truth, that consciousness is stranger and more wonderful than we usually dare to imagine, that reality extends far beyond the boundaries of the merely physical, and that some encounters change us so profoundly that we can never again be content with the shallow explanations that satisfy those who have never walked the deeper paths. Tonight we have walked those paths together. Tomorrow the choice becomes yours, whether to remember these tales as mere entertainment or to recognize them as invitations to explore dimensions of existence that await your personal discovery. The forest is patient, the mysteries endure, and somewhere in the shadows between the trees, ancient powers continue their eternal watch, waiting for the next traveler brave enough to venture beyond the edge of the mapped world and into the heart of wonder itself.